Go home. My grandfathers and great grandfathers.
We are here again with Bill Ferris, one of the most eminent folklorists of the American South, and we are in the second of the series of interviews we've been doing with Bill about four documentary films that were released in 1975. And the one we're going to talk about today is called Two Black Churches. And Bill, Two Black Churches documents, worship and faith communities, in both Vicksburg, Mississippi and in New Haven, Connecticut. And I'm curious, what prompted you to juxtapose those two particular congregations, and what did you hope to reveal by contrasting them within a single film?
Well, the first church I've known since I was a, a baby. It's on the farm where I grew up, Rose Hill Church. And when I was quite young, 4 or 5, a lady who took care of me named Mary Gordon would take me to church every first Sunday. The minister uh, would come uh, once a month on the first Sunday, and we would go to those services. I learned to sing the hymns and I loved the sermons. So it was a part of my life. And in many ways, when I realized there were no hymnals, that everything was sung from memory, I realized that when those families were no longer there, the music would disappear. And as a teenager, I began to record and photograph and later film the services to preserve that memory. And that really was the foundation of my life as a folklorist. What I began there quite young, I've continued to this moment. I carry my iPhone and will photograph, record, and sometimes film. So that church was an obvious place to begin a film that would look at the roots of Black religion in the South. So that was the first sort of anchor of a film that also looked at the migration of Black families out of the South into northern urban areas. And I happened to be teaching at Yale and was told about St. James's Church, which is one of those communities, in this case from North Carolina, who moved to the New Haven area. And the church represents those families in a very different service, a sanctified service with much more dramatic music and faith healing and sermons. The style of the sermon is similar, but again, it's an important contrast geographically and musically and culturally. The St. James Church is obviously a much more affluent, and it's different.
Church spaces are, by their nature, intimate, right? And you also had intimate conversations with the congregation members and preachers. And what was it like to gain the trust of these communities and to be present, in these sacred moments? Really, I mean, were there any challenges or surprises during the filmmaking?
Well, since I was a child, I have always felt privileged to be allowed into those spaces. The church is a safe haven for Black families. The Black church is. And it's like a Black town or a juke joint. These are Black spaces owned and controlled by Black families. And as a child and later as an adult folklorist working in them, I felt privileged to be welcomed in. And the minister, Reverend Isaac Thomas at Rose Hill, in one of his sermons, addressed me, and he said that the doors of welcome on the church would always open on the hinges of welcome when I came there, as a way of saying, we are happy to have you with us. And they, both churches, we spoke with about what we were doing with this film, and they were happy to welcome us with our camera and equipment. And they spoke with us off camera about religion. The baptismal ceremony was shot earlier in the late 60s with a Super 8 camera when I was just beginning to make films. Super 8, black and white, very grainy with wild sound, but it works quite powerfully as the procession crosses a cotton field to a little pond, and then the baptism is conducted there. So that's a segue into the color film in the 1974 production of Two Black Churches, but it fits.
Yeah. We were talking earlier when we began this chat about the differences, you saw in the worship styles and the theology and the community life, between Rose Hill Church in Mississippi and St. James in Connecticut. Uh, what similarities between the two places struck you the most?
Well, one similarity is the powerful presence of the preacher, who is a man in both churches. And traditionally, men have been advantaged within Black religion as ministers. They are the head of the church. And they're surrounded by the mothers of the church, who basically are like the sergeants in the army. I mean, they see that the doors are opened on time, that linen cover is on the table where the sacraments are going to be served, and they are the force that keeps the church together. So you have a kind of common structure within the church, and it is a celebratory moment. I mean, the dress at both churches is elegant, colorful, beautiful. And the hymns, there's no question that the St. James's service, with its elaborate choir and music, is also, if you were to ask, quite familiar with the a cappella Dr. Watts hymns, traditional hymns and spirituals that would be sung in the rural southern churches like Rose Hill. So there's a continuum, and the roots of Black religion are deep in both churches. They are rooted in rural southern worlds that can be felt in both services, but they're also quite different.
When you shot both of these, Rose Hill in the late 60s and then St. James in the early 70s, two very different regions, but segregation was still very much at play, although in different ways in those different places. And so I'm curious, how did you in the two different churches, how did you notice that community bedrock role?
The church, in both instances, is the safe haven. It's where both communities, and in the case of Rose Hill, while many of the members lived within a mile or two of the church, many others lived in Vicksburg, 15 miles away, and some lived in Aurora, Illinois, many, many miles away. But when their family members died, they were brought back and laid to rest in the churchyard. So it is kind of the home place in every sense. It's a place where both when you're alive and when you finally die, you feel you want to be. When you really, it's a place of communing with relatives and friends who come together and linger after the service, and often will bring fried chicken and baskets of food and eat either in the church or outside. Uh, and there's a sense of commune with nature. The church is your way of at least recreating that feeling of security and the power of religion and a service in a distant land, the diaspora, we might think of it, of rural black families who moved out of the South. Uh, in this case, uh, Rose Hill, and the central migration was to Chicago. The eastern migration from the Carolinas was to New York, Philadelphia, and New Haven. And the western migration, Louisiana, Arkansas, was to California. So wherever those families moved, you would find churches like St. James's Church. And where they came from, you would find churches like Rose Hill.
We were talking about Give My Poor Heart Ease the last time we had one of these chats. One of the things that you said to me that really stuck with me was you were talking about you felt like the documentation you were doing was both a form of protest uh, against the racism that you saw people subjected to, and a form of preservation. You're giving voice to stories that were generally left out of the historical record. And I'm wondering, did that philosophy come to play when you were making Two Black Churches?
Absolutely. It came to play in all four of these films. Anytime you document and show respect for and preserve the Black experience, that's a political act, because many people would prefer to see it erased from our history, and we're doing the opposite. We're etching a mark on the face of oblivion for the Black voice, the Black face, and the Black tradition culturally in these films. And when we look at the church, we're looking at a powerful kind of a voice and secure space for political movements like the civil rights movement and the abolitionist movement, Frederick Douglass, and all of the leaders of Black freedom from the beginning to the present have religion deeply embedded in that movement. And the churches physically were where organizing was often done. They were often burned by Ku Klux Klan and others uh, because of that. And you just see the church as a monumental structure that stands out on the landscape in both rural and urban worlds.
Earlier in this conversation, you were talking about Mary Gordon at Rose Hill. And I know she appears in this film. And I remember from, conversations when you and I were first getting to know each other a decade ago, you talking about how, Ms. Gordon was someone who brought you into that church, when you were a young man. What kind of impact did Mary Gordon, looking back on it 50 years later, have on your life as it's played out? And like, how do you remember her?
I don't think words can express the full extent of what she did to open my eyes and to expand my awareness of life. Uh, I spent many, many hours with her in our home. She often sang, no matter what she was doing. You would hear music that she would be singing, and it was usually a hymn uh, that she would be humming. And she had a sense of humor. We would see after celebrating the New Year, she would sometimes say, "Well, it seems like I haven't seen you for a year." And then we would laugh. She had little uh, jokes that were familiar, and you were always happy to hear them. And she had a deep knowledge of both her family and my family. And her stepfather had a photographic memory. And when my mother was asked to write a brief history of Rose Hill, they had a centennial service. She went to him to get the names of all the ministers who had been there. And he gave her the names and the dates. And she said, "Now, how can I be sure these are correct?" And he said, "Ask me when any of your 5 children were born, and when you were married, and when your father died." He had every date accurate. So she came from a tradition of memory. And when she was dying, she was in a nursing home in Vicksburg, and I went to see her there. And all of her family were with her. And I was sitting by the bed and holding her hand. And she looked at me and she said, "You're my black child." And I said, "Thank you." But that was, to me, that was a recognition of a kind of bond between us. And in many ways, my career as a folklorist has been dedicated to her and to the worlds that I saw as so important to me, but also threatened. The loss of memory of those people and their music and stories was something I did not want to allow to the degree that I could. And I think the career I've followed as a folklorist has been part of that effort to preserve memory and to encourage my students to do the same in their families.
Right. You have spoken to me more than once, and certainly in the last interview we did about Give My Poor Heart Ease, about how the idea of bridging or building bridges through your work as a folklorist between different communities, and documenting, how important documenting these vanishing cultural landscapes is to you. Uh, and I wonder, um, how, when you look at those specific goals of your long career as a folklorist, uh, how do you feel that do you feel that two black churches specifically, uh, speaks to that larger mission?
I do. I think two things really rise when you see these two services. One is the power of religion. Regardless of race, you're moved emotionally and inspired by the voices and the power of the music, the sermon. Um, the other is the power of the music itself. And we could argue that out of these two musical traditions, the rural spirituals and hymns and the urban gospel, gospel and rural are mixed in both places, but the gospel tends to be associated with the urban. But out of those musical traditions came the jazz, the blues, uh, hip hop, rap, rock and roll, uh, white gospel. I mean, America's musical legacy and classical music and literature in The Color Purple. There's so much of our culture that is shaped and defined by the Black voice. And in these two churches, you dip deep into that tradition. And it's easy to see the kind of power that goes far beyond the walls of these churches into Lincoln Center, into the academic worlds of literature, and uh, there's no limit to how these two little services can be understood as keys to who we are as Americans and as citizens of a planet, because the the ripple effect of that music and that experience from slavery to the present is beyond measure. We will look back in 50 to 100 years and we will see far more clearly, perhaps, than we do today, how our culture as Americans is in many ways Black culture. And we don't acknowledge it, but visitors to this country see it. And Carl Jung was traveling around and he said, I'm struck by how these white Americans talk and walk like Blacks. They don't acknowledge it, but their culture is so Black. And Robert Ferris Thompson, the art historian with whom I was privileged to work, devoted his life to looking at the blackening of American culture through African and Black American uh, music and religion. When we look at religion, one of the things we see is a blending. We talked about the blending of white and Black compositions within both churches, but the blending of African derived voodoo with its sacred use of the snake as the chief god, Damballa, and the spirit possession, where the believer is possessed and ridden like a horse. Uh, that is part of Black, quote, Christian tradition as well. So the parallels within these two churches of both African and European religious tradition is quite powerful. So there are many ways to approach these two services, and it's a rich body of experience that film allows us to walk into and experience in the deepest way.
I got one last question for you. Looking back at two black churches 50 years later, is there a particular moment or image from the film that has stayed with you the most across the last 5 decades? A scene that maybe captures the heart of what you were hoping to convey when you made that film?
There is. It's in Rose Hill Church, and there was a family there. Some of them still live there, the McGowan family. And they have, no matter which generation, they call themselves the McGowan family gospel singers. In this case, they were young children, maybe 6 to 10. And they stepped up and sang a little gospel song. And the power of that, the innocence of those voices singing with such clarity. And the very last note, this young girl tilts her head and looks up at the camera in a very knowing, beautiful way. And that just sort of summarized, that is the note on which we go from this rural Baptist church to the urban sanctified church, because it really carries through, and it's a moment that you just can't get out of your mind and your memory. It's a perfect kind of note to capture everything in the church and what that means for the families.
Well, I am so glad you captured that. I'm so glad that we have the opportunity to sit here and talk about it 50 years later. And I'm very much looking forward to our conversation next month when we will talk about your film Made in Mississippi.
Thank you, Chuck. It's an honor to be on your program.
Well, I appreciate you doing this for all the readers, and I guess we can say now watchers of Salvation South. So I will see you again soon, Bill. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Looking forward to it. Bye bye.
Bye bye.